We find it really noticeable. When we don't stand, the other party can usually get away with not talking about the issues that we really care about, particularly the climate. When the Greens aren't on the ballot paper, other parties can get away with, at best, giving lip service to the climate crisis, but also to the really fundamental issues around inequality. Everybody says that they're for reducing child poverty, obviously. But we know that the only way you are really going to do that in this country is by redistributing wealth, by taking from the incredibly, obscenely wealthy and putting it into the services that support people who are currently living in poverty to lift them out of it. If we're not there to talk about that, no other mainstream party wants a wealth tax. No other mainstream party is talking about taxing the rich to do this stuff. The first point of success for us has already happened in that we are standing a record number of candidates. There's 57 constituencies in Scotland. We're standing in 44. The best that we'd ever done previously was 31. For the first time, the vast majority of people in Scotland will have the opportunity to vote Green.
Ross Greer, welcome along, Caley Corner. I really appreciate you coming in tonight, mate.
Thanks very much for having me.
No worries. So obviously it's election season, presumably Bute campaigning. How's things been going?
It's really, it's great fun, election campaigns. I'm definitely a weirdo, willing to admit it. That my first thought when Rishi Sunak went out there, stood in the rain and called the election was I was actually dead excited. Primarily because 14 years of Tory government have caused so much harm to so many people, and clearly they're going to lose. That is a good thing. They're losing a couple of months sooner than we all expected. Fantastic. But I'm also one of those kind of people who, I love election campaigns, partly because of and it sounds like a cliche, but it's genuinely not. See, actually going out and speaking to normal people on their doorsteps about what they actually care about. I love that, because otherwise, a lot of my job, you spend a lot of time, in Parliament or with key stakeholders or whatever, and you don't get nearly enough time to go out and speak to normal people. And most of my interactions with people in those kind of normal intervening periods, it's social media, and it's just torrents of abuse from bots and a few obsessed people who just cannot stop. Most people aren't like that, and most people actually, they might not think they're political. Loads of people, you come to their door and they're like, I'm not really into politics. But then you talk to them for a couple of seconds and the issues start coming out, the stuff they care about, whether it's, local public transport or the hospital or, Gaza in particular at the moment. I always think of the Jimmy Reid quote, the Glasgow trade unionist. Jimmy Reid made the point that it is absolutely not that ordinary people are apathetic, they don't care. They're alienated by politics, but people do care about the issues. So that's what I like about the election campaign. You actually get to go out and speak to people, and the public actually really want this country to be better. People have so much hope. The problem is that hope is often crushed and suppressed by our political system.
I know, absolutely. There's a couple of points there, so you wouldn't mind if I caption the thumbnail, Ross Greer, I'm a weirdo, or something like that, just as that.
Self-confessed weirdo.
Yeah, I like that. Right in the first minute. And then also, Liam McLaughlin, who was in last week for an SSP, and I had sort of framed a question about young people, in my opinion, and even my generation. I'm slightly older, I'm a millennial, I think. No, I can't remember, I'm 87, whatever, somebody will tell us. And we're not as politicised, I don't think. And he sort of reframed it and was like, well, what are politics doing to sort of engage people? I think it's like a deliberate ploy, for the big parties to keep people apathetic, unfortunately. But when you've been on the doorsteps, then what do you think is going to be the sort of key battlegrounds for you guys in the Greens to get some MPs potentially elected or get a better share of the vote?
So for us, it's an interesting one, because in terms of I'll talk about the politics then, the issues, but in terms of the politics of it, a lot of the people that I'm speaking to, huge numbers of people across Scotland, have spent the last 10 years voting for the SNP for a whole variety of reasons, respect for Nicola Sturgeon, support for independence, scunnered with Labour aligning themselves with the Tories, all the stuff that people are familiar with. There's clearly a break there now. There's a lot of people who've been voting SNP for quite a while now because they wanted something left of centre, progressive, however you want to describe it, and they don't feel they're getting that anymore. And obviously, a lot of those people are breaking to the Labour Party. But when we're on people's doorsteps and talking to them, there is a much more of an interest to speak to us, particularly in the places in Scotland where Labour haven't necessarily been as strong in the first place. So I'm hearing from our activists in places like Orkney and Shetland or Dumfries and Galway, really interesting feedback from them, because you've got a lot of those left-wing progressive people who are, done with the SNP or think they're done with the SNP, probably not voting for them, and who do see us as that attractive prospect, particularly because over the last couple of years, for all it ended in difficult circumstances, they saw what happened when Greens were in power. They got free bus travel for young people. We were the ones who took peak time fares off the railways, record spending on climate and nature. We taxed the rich to pay for this stuff. So people liked what they saw. So that has had an impact. Usually small parties in government become less popular. By the end of our period in government, albeit it ended much quicker than we had planned, we come out of it more popular than we went in. So there's an element there of people who still want to vote for a progressive party that had been the SNP for quite a long time now, not willing to go over to Labour, whether it's because of Gaza, lack of distinction between them and the Tories, sense that Starmer flip-flops, you can't trust him, all these things. And they definitely are interested in a party like the Greens because we're consistent in our values and we actually act on them when we get elected. The challenge in Scotland at a general election is a lot of the UK-wide coverage of the issues defining the election is about stuff that's actually devolved. So the economy is the one, UK-wide, but other than the economy, the issues that usually decide elections are health and education. Now, those are devolved in Scotland. So there's always that kind of muddle of which bit of this is actually relevant to a Westminster election or not. Because ultimately, the single biggest deciding factor in the quality of our health and education services in Scotland is how much money we can put into them. That ultimately comes from Westminster, so it's really, really relevant there. It is quite challenging to talk to folk about that, though, because quite understandably, if you're speaking to somebody on the doorstep who has been sitting in a 8-hour queue at A&E or whatever, they don't really want to talk about the fiscal framework between the UK and the Scottish Government, so the block grant or Barnett or anything like that. They want to talk about cutting the waiting time at A&E, quite rightly. It's we know that upstream from that is that funding issue that's causing so many of these problems. Or in the case of the health service, immigration is the other big one. Massive labour shortages within the health service that Brexit has made so much worse. So that's how we try and connect the dots on these issues. Because you could, frankly, as a political party in Scotland, you can get away with running a pretty dishonest election campaign. You can get away with running a Westminster campaign that is focused on devolved issues. I've an MP candidate in my area is campaigning really, really hard on issues that have nothing to do with the UK government. Some of them are devolved to the Scottish government, and most of them are local council issues. She is a local councillor and could be doing something about that, but she's not. She's using it as a campaign issue to get elected as an MP, which I think is dishonest, but unfortunately you can get away with that. We're trying to connect the dots there and say, look, people do want to talk about health and education, quite rightly. Here is what Green MPs at Westminster can do about that, because a Green MP at Westminster can't, for example, in Scotland, abolish standardised testing. That's a Green Party policy. I'm pushing for that in the Scottish Parliament where we can do that. Green MPs at Westminster can make sure that we're taxing the rich to fund public services. That money gets passed to the Scottish Government and we can put more money into the system so we can hire teachers, so we can protect staff from being cut, so we can sort out our additional support needs services. So you need to kind of join the dots between these issues critically without it looking to the person that you're speaking to like you're trying to pass the buck.
Aye, there's obviously a lot to unpack in that, Ross. That was quite the answer. We'll get to some of that. But wow, I'm keen for, like you mentioned, some of these local councils, and I hope you're going to name them actually. You've been very diplomatic there.
It's the Lib Dems. I'm absolutely fine. The Lib Dems run the most duplicitous election campaigns you've ever seen. The Tories are the most dangerous people in politics, certainly in the mainstream parties, but the Lib Dems are the most duplicitous.
Well, I don't think they're polling too well at the moment. I'm not sure how well they're going to do in Scotland or even in the wider sort of UK level. But anyway, I'm glad you named them there. What about the objectives for the Greens? Like you mentioned, obviously, Barnett formula, the sort of fiscal sort of side of things. So what is a good outcome for the Greens in this election? I think there is room for a protest vote there. So do you think that is there any seats that you're targeting where you're going, we could get a candidate in these areas, whether it's Shetland or anywhere else?
So the first point of success for us, I think, is already happened, to be honest, which is we find it really noticeable when we don't stand, the other parties can usually get away with not talking about the issues that we really care about, particularly the climate. When the Greens aren't on the ballot paper, other parties can get away with, at best, giving lip service to the climate crisis, but also to the really fundamental issues around inequality. Everybody says that they're for reducing child poverty, obviously. But we know that the only way you are really going to do that in this country is by redistributing wealth, by taking from the incredibly obscenely wealthy and putting it into the services that support people who are currently living in poverty to lift them out of it. if we're not there to talk about that, no other mainstream party wants a wealth tax. No other mainstream party is talking about taxing the rich to do this stuff. So the first point of success for us has already happened in that we are standing a record number of candidates. There's 57 constituencies in Scotland. We're standing in 44. The best that we'd ever done previously was 31. So for the first time, the vast majority of people in Scotland, about 3 in 4 people, will have the opportunity to vote Green. And that's already shifting the debate. And we saw that particularly last week, and actually the first couple of weeks of the campaign around the issue of oil and gas licensing. It really kind of came to the fore, where the SNP were trying to face both ways on that. And the Tories in particular were attacking them from the perspective of oil and gas companies. The Tories are doing the bidding of BP, Shell, Total, all that kind of stuff. We can come at it from the other side and say, the climate science here is absolutely categorically clear. You cannot have new oil and gas fields. So the SNP's position of, we'll judge it on a case-by-case basis, it doesn't really make any sense, because what's the difference between 2 oil fields? They have the same impact on the climate. So just being in the debate, that's already a point of success for us, because we've got really good coverage, we've got really good challenge to other parties on things like a wealth tax on the top 1%, no more oil and gas licenses. Looking ahead to the results, we are perfectly realistic about the challenges of first past the post. We have a really great track record of success in Scotland of getting Greens elected to local councils, to the Scottish Parliament. We've never had a Scottish Green MP before. Down south, there's a couple of seats that we are really very optimistic about. So obviously we're hoping to hold Brighton Pavilion, which is Caroline Lucas's seat. Caroline's retiring at this election, but the new candidate, Shan Berry, I think is going to be able to hold that seat. The one that I'll be going down to campaign in actually for a couple of days is Bristol Central. So they just had their council elections a couple of weeks ago there in May. Every single council ward in the new Bristol Central constituency elected a Green councillor. So it has a Labour MP at the moment, Thangham Debonair, who's shadow cabinet, Labour frontbench spokesperson. But the Green Party of England Wales co-leader, Carla Denyer, who's been a councillor in that area for a long time. Carla's running for that seat. I'm going down to help her because we think pretty good chance there. But the other one that shows all the different places that these Green votes are coming from is a seat, Waveney Valley. So the area around the river. And that's a Tory-held seat, and I think it's been Tory for as long as the constituencies in that area have existed. For the past 100 years, the area of universal franchise, that area has had a Tory MP. But if I was betting on it now, I think the English Greens' other co-leader, Adrian Ramsay, is going to take that seat from the Tories, because that whole area has seen a huge swing to the Greens. So the Greens now have majority control over that council, Mid-Suffolk Council. That's the first ever council anywhere in the UK with a majority of Greens elected to a Green council administration. And a lot of it is not because rural Tories are switching to the Greens. So obviously that's happening because the Tories are shedding votes to everyone, everywhere at the moment for all sorts of reasons. But it's the fact that in that area, nobody has ever previously tried to coalesce the anti-Tory vote, the progressive vote. And for all the kind of stereotype of your rural English constituencies being full of people who are small c conservative, actually there are lots of progressive-minded people across the length and breadth of the UK. And what we've been able to do in an area like that is bring that whole progressive coalition together and say, actually, uniting behind the Greens, who are active in this community, whose councillors are delivering for this community, could make history by electing the first Green MP. So I'm optimistic that for the first time, we will actually have a Green group in the House of Commons, multiple MPs. For the last 14 years, we've just had the one, Caroline. I think we could actually have a Green group at Westminster now.
Aye, and what a fantastic MP she's been for a long time.
An absolute legend.
We'll maybe talk about first past the post and proportional representation at some point. I know that's obviously a big policy of yours that you're trying to push there. But you mentioned the environment and sort of climate change. Obviously, you have been in the government in Scotland for the past couple of years, and the climate change targets got scrapped. And I was talking about this briefly with Matt Winnan, who's wrote a book about climate change. He's sort of environmental scientist. How's that playing out on the doorsteps? Because me personally, I'm not sure how good a look that is for you guys as an environmental party with those policies getting scrapped as early as they did.
Well, it's a terrible look. It's disastrous optics. The story behind it, though, it is quite different from what the headlines portray. So the target that was scrapped is 75% emission reduction by 2030. That's something that Parliament agreed to back in 2019. That target has been scrapped not because of a failure over the last kind of 2 or 3 years, that period where the Greens were in government, but because frankly, it was already unreachable by the time we joined the government. And that failure is a result of years and decades of inaction that came before it. Because if you look over the period of that 3 years since we joined the government in autumn 2021, Scottish Government's action to reduce its emissions massively scaled up. So this year, Scottish Government is spending £4.7 billion on climate and nature. That's a record amount of funding, and that's because we were in the room insisting that that was the budget allocation for that. So we massively escalated climate action. Even with that escalated action, we could not hit the 2030 target. And it wasn't because of a lack of political will. It was by the time we'd actually got Greens in the room to make these decisions, it was past the point where we could actually get the 2030 target back on track. It was always going to be really, really ambitious. And we're in this situation where all the experts said, you're not going to be able to do 2030 anymore, not the 75% by 2030. But 2045, hitting net zero for emissions then, that is still possible. And that's what we need to make sure we stay on track to. So that's why when we were in government, we said, look, the law currently requires the Scottish Government to produce a plan to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030. All the experts are now telling us that's just not possible anymore. So you need to square the legal circle there. The Scottish Government was being legally required to do something that was no longer physically possible. So the only thing you can do is to change the law in that circumstance. That's a shit thing to have to do, to be a Green Party in government that says the climate target's not reachable anymore. But it wasn't because we had somehow joined the government and then sat on our hands and not done the things that were required. The only scenario that would have got us vaguely close to 75% by 2030 was to literally ban all cars overnight. And that would, quite obviously collapse society. You would have, no ambulances, no fire engines, no food would get to the shops because all the lorries had been benched. People couldn't drive anywhere. Obviously just not possible or viable.
Not really a vote winner, that one, is it?
Exactly. Yeah, you can't really go door to door and explain that. But at the same time as saying, look, the target's not reachable, what we announced was a package of new measures. So things like a carbon emission land tax that we'd talked about before, the Greens had announced previously, moving forward with that, but also new measures around actually reducing traffic levels, because that's the one area in Scotland that we have failed on our emissions. Transport emissions have actually gone up. We've reduced emissions all over the place, but transport, agriculture and how we heat our buildings, those are the areas that weren't working. And in transport and how we heat our buildings, the Greens were actually really beginning to make substantial amounts of progress in that short period of time that we were in government. Problem is, the headline was Scottish Government scraps climate targets. That was because it was leaked the night before. So we, the Green Party and the SNP and the government overall, had a communications plan for how, on the day, we were going to explain to people, this target is not physically possible anymore. We need to do something else. But we're not just lowering the target. We're taking this whole new raft of actions. We're escalating our action, because that's what counts. Like, climate targets don't save the world. Climate action does. The plan was to announce all that together. It was leaked before from outside of government, actually, by a key stakeholder. Deeply disappointing. That leak totally wrecked any chance that we had of being able to set the narrative and explain to people why we were having to do this. And critically, it eliminated any chance that we had to explain to our own party members within the Scottish Greens why we were doing this. Our members had this 24-hour period where they saw a headline saying that the government we were in was scrapping its climate targets. We weren't able to tell them what was happening because government is not allowed to tell anybody else before it tells Parliament. And the statement to Parliament was scheduled for the Thursday afternoon. So when that leaked on the Wednesday, a lot of our members spent 24 hours, quite understandably, getting pretty distressed about that. And me and Patrick and Lorna, the other MSPs, we weren't allowed to tell them what was going on, or we would have breached a pretty significant part of the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament's information sharing protocols. So like Patrick and Lorna would have been sacked as government ministers if they'd told anybody else what was going on. In that 24-hour period, everybody who had any reason to attack us piled right in. And that meant that we'd lost control of the narrative because of that leak. And the leak came from those who are actually on our side in the fight against the climate crisis. They made a catastrophic mistake, and those responsible, those names may end up in the public domain one day. I hope they realise just how much damage they've done to the cause of tackling the climate crisis in Scotland, because they absolutely played a role in bringing down the Bute House Agreement and the Scottish Greens' role in the government.
Aye, well, it's a lot there. I can see you're getting quite passionate about that, Ross. You mentioned ending it, the Bute House Agreement. I was going to ask you about this, obviously. I think it is topical and it is something that will probably be significant for people who are independent supporters and maybe be thinking about voting for the Greens in Scotland, for example. So was there anything else at play? Like, what were the other reasons that the Bute House Agreement sort of came in, and can you talk about some of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the key thing for me is to say that it was completely avoidable. Like, I find the whole situation really quite tragic and sad, because it didn't need to happen. It didn't need to play out that way. Ultimately, it was a decision taken by Humza Yousaf, and Humza's still a guy that I respect. He is still somebody that I would consider a friend. He made a catastrophic error, a really catastrophic error, and I don't see how he and the people around him thought it was going to play out any differently, because Humza ended a confidence agreement. At the absolute core of the Bute House Agreement is a confidence and supply agreement that the government had the votes of the Green MSPs on matters of confidence, votes of confidence, i.e. that the government's survival was guaranteed because it had a majority in Parliament. SNP plus Green equals a majority. Humza ended a confidence agreement and then expected to still have our confidence. But he had our confidence. The Scottish Government had our confidence, and SNP First Ministers had our confidence in exchange for that policy programme that we had agreed. Because for us, politics, it's not a numbers game. Like, I don't think that my party is winning because its polling is up or our membership are up or we're getting more people elected. I think my party's winning when it's delivering the kind of change that we all believe in. For me, yeah, it's great to get Greens elected, but the real wins are when we do things like give every young person in Scotland free bus travel, abolish peak time rail fares, when we clear out, when we cancel all school meal debt. Those are the wins. The Scottish Government and the First Ministers had our confidence because we had agreed a shared policy programme that delivered that kind of stuff. And I'm in politics to deliver change that helps people and planet. I'm not in politics to win the numbers game for my party every 5 years. So the end of that meant, what we were posed with the question, well, why would we have confidence in Humza as First Minister at that point? Because it was quite clear to us that there was a lurch to the right happening in the SNP. Not because Humza's personal politics had moved to the right, but because there's a grouping within the SNP who have always been to the right of where the rest of their party are. And that grouping had simply exerted so much pressure internally that the combination of that, and yes, the instability that came about as a result of the climate targets, but also the decision of health boards in Scotland to stop prescribing puberty blockers to young people, a clinical decision, not a political one, but some people within our party reacted very, very strongly to that. So those reasons collectively contributed towards a situation where we were to have a general meeting of our party where our members would get to decide whether or not we stayed in government. I'm absolutely confident that our members would have decided that, probably by a margin of, I think, about 2-1, because I spoke to a huge number of people in the period between the general meeting being called and Humza ending the agreement early. And I think for a lot of them, the response I was getting from party members was, look, we didn't think this was going to be easy. We're not enjoying where we are now, but would Scotland be a fairer, greener place in 2026 if we stayed in government or if we left? Well, clearly it would be fairer and greener if we stayed. So we're going to stay. This is difficult, but we knew when we got into government that it was going to be difficult. So that was the kind of conversations we were having. And I feel really sad about the way it all played out. And I don't have any personal animosity towards Humza whatsoever. He made a bad call. He made a disastrously bad call, but he owned the consequences of it. And the government and the parliament have now moved on to the next stage. So our focus now as a party back in opposition is say, well, how can we maximise our influence from opposition? How can we continue to deliver as much of this agenda as possible from opposition? I still think that we can get to 2026 and have rent controls in Scotland, that we can still have expanded rights for tenants and protection from eviction, because just before we left government, we published the bill to do that. And that's still a government bill. And if the SNP take that bill through Parliament, they will absolutely have our support. So that's our focus, is on just making sure that that stuff that people really, really need is actually delivered.
I know. I'm glad that you're still prepared to like work together and, like you say, implement the sort of policies that will make things more equitable for society. That would be good. You mentioned the cash report though, and you sort of said that members within your party. Like, what do you mean by that? Do you mean members of parliament, or you mean like the party membership at a local sort of level? They were sort of making noise about this, and that was obviously causing a bit of contention. Like, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, ordinary party members. We're a genuine internal democracy. Within our party, I have one vote, just like Patrick has one vote, and just like or Lorna, or just like any other party member does. So when it came to the general meeting, the MSPs were not going to have more of a say than any other member, because Greens believe in grassroots democracy, so that's how our party is structured. But we did have some members who thought that we could not stay in a government who ultimately was responsible for a health service in which two health boards had decided that they were going to halt the prescription of puberty blockers for young trans people. Now, I completely understand why we have members who felt deeply, deeply upset by that decision. I was upset by that decision. All of our MSPs were. And if you listen to the statement that Jenny Minto, the SNP Public Health Minister, made in Parliament, it was clear that the situation was distressing her as well. But clinical decisions are made by clinicians. And in the discussions I had with our party members about it, I was emphasising our absolute continued commitment to trans rights, but also we at that point, when we still were in government, were committed to delivering on the reform of trans healthcare services in Scotland, because they are incredibly poor. The longest waiting times in the Scottish NHS are for trans people just trying to receive healthcare, like way longer than anybody else. But if you think about the long-term consequences of political interference in clinical decisions, it's not going to end well for not just trans people, but all LGBTQ people and other minority groups. Because if you say that, right, politicians can overrule clinical decisions, the weight of opinion in this country at the moment across the public at large is absolutely still with the LGBTQ community and still with trans people in particular. But the political environment is quite different. And you cannot guarantee that it's always going to be progressive, equality-minded people in positions of power. So if you're saying that politicians can overrule clinical decisions, you need to be prepared for politicians who do not have equality and the best interests of trans people at heart to be in a position in the future where they could start overruling clinical decisions. That's not a position that I want to be in, even if I am really quite uncomfortable and I'm upset with this clinical decision. So that's how we got to a position on that specifically of saying, well, look, the cash reviews for NHS England, not for Scotland, but the Chief Medical Officer is leading a review at the moment to consider what the potential implications for Scotland are. And from our perspective, saying, okay, the relevant clinicians in Scotland didn't feel that they had the evidence they needed to be confident to continue prescribing puberty blockers to young trans people. So for me, the question is, well, how can we provide them with that evidence? There's a huge amount of international evidence out there in support of this. So it was about saying, well, what support do those clinicians actually need? Obviously, if you are particularly a trans person yourself, you and your community have been under so much vicious attack, really the most vile, horrible, dangerous attacks for the last couple of years, and that's only been escalating. I'm not for a moment critical of trans people who reacted the way they did to that, because it was yet more chipping away at their basic rights to live their lives. From our perspective, though, that was a very separate issue to the political issue around the climate targets, because it was ultimately a clinical decision, and we'd be heading down a very bad path that would end very badly for trans people if we started having political interference in clinical decisions become the norm in Scotland.
It's obviously it's a serious topic, and hopefully we can talk about it sort of respectfully here. But you mentioned that they were recommending that they don't distribute the puberty blockers. I think that if they're already in flight, that's been honoured, right? I think it's just new.
Any new prescriptions, yeah.
And is that not like a fair position to take? Like if the people who are working the health service, had some reservations, because it sounds like that's what's happened here. Yeah.
So you're talking about a literal handful of young people who were on a path to being prescribed these puberty blockers, who are now not able to get them. For those young people, that's deeply, deeply distressing. We know, I can't begin to, those of us who are not trans can't really understand what it would be like to go through the wrong puberty and how distressing that is. But I've spoken to so many trans people who explain that. I did an interview a while ago where somebody said to me, it's absolutely fine. I know a 34-year-old has just transitioned. No issues at all with them being prescribed what they need to transition. That's great, and I really support them. But surely that's the kind of thing that we should be supporting adults to go through, not under 18s. But every 34-year-old trans person that I've spoken to who transitioned after puberty has explained to me just how monumentally distressing that is for them. And we know huge amounts of evidence how bad the outcomes are for trans people who don't receive gender-affirming care when they're going through puberty. And those negative outcomes, that's in terms of their mental and physical health, but right up to and including, tragically, suicide. Really terrible, terrible rates of suicide amongst the trans community for people who don't receive gender-affirming care. So if what we're doing here is saying that healthcare for trans people should focus on reducing the harm caused to trans people, if we're saying it's about protecting them, there's a huge amount of evidence that says gender-affirming care when a trans person is going through puberty is absolutely critical to making sure that they have good outcomes in terms of their mental and their physical health, and that they quite literally survive the very difficult experience of being a trans person in society right now, because that is not easy. And there is a huge amount of international evidence that there's a very valid critique of the Cash Review and how it selected evidence, and I was really uncomfortable with what quickly emerged when some of us in the Greens raised that criticism. We were being accused of all sorts of stuff, accused of being anti-science and things like that. Science absolutely depends on debate and critique. It is absolutely essential that scientific papers and any conclusion, particularly in the field of medicine, this is absolutely the case, that there's critique and there's challenge and there's discussion. And the idea that this review is being held to a completely different standard, i.e. it is infallible and that it is totally illegitimate to question it, that puts it apart from all of the rest of science, so far as I understand it. Certainly, there have been plenty of occasions in the past where MSPs have challenged clinicians, because that is our job. Our job is not to overrule clinicians, but our job is to scrutinise the health service and scrutinise the decision it makes, and that includes challenging clinicians on really, really important issues. I actually think it's an example of how deeply embedded transphobia is in our society, that we were being told, you're not even allowed to question this. That's illegitimate. And we were being told that in many cases by politicians who have quite rightly challenged clinicians on all sorts of other decisions in the past about all sorts of other areas of healthcare. Why is this area of healthcare different? Why are we being told you cannot possibly challenge the conclusions of this report by people who have quite rightly challenged the conclusions of all sorts of other medical reports? Because that's our job, not to overrule, but to challenge and to scrutinise.
Aye, it goes both ways though, and I think that's what the Cash report says, right? That I think that a lot of the evidence out there is disputed, it seems like, and there's no this international consensus, unfortunately.
Not entirely. I would argue that the balance of evidence is on the side of prescribing, but clearly there's a debate there and a debate to be had. Our argument would be, if you're thinking about following the precautionary principle, there is certainly not some overwhelming compelling weight of evidence that says it is harmful to prescribe puberty blockers to young trans people. So if you're following the precautionary principle, the status quo up until not that long ago was that these prescriptions took place, and lots of positive outcomes for trans people who've had that kind of affirming care. Our argument would have been, well, the precautionary principle is, unless the evidence is strongly saying otherwise, you continue with what has been the case up until now, until the point where the evidence is actually saying, no, you need to do something different. And if the conclusion there was, there's not enough evidence, we need to gather more evidence, that's different from a conclusion which says, no, this is actually actively harmful and you need to stop. The conclusion was not actively harmful, you need to stop. The conclusion was, we need more evidence, this is inconclusive. My argument there is you follow the precautionary principle, what you do through across much of science, and you continue with what you've been doing until you have a compelling reason to do otherwise, because there's clearly a risk of harm from halting puberty blockers. That's my real concern now, is for the young trans people who are on that path and who are expecting to be able to get that prescription and who are now not. And I really want to make sure that they get the support, they and their families get the support that they need, because we know, tragically, we have lots of examples and lots of evidence of really negative outcomes for young trans people who don't receive gender affirming care.
Aye, that's a tough one. I appreciate you sort of explaining that there. I think you've done it pretty well, Ross. Move on a wee bit, if that's all right, to the independence sort of aspect of the Greens, because I was a wee bit surprised there when you said you were going down to Bristol earlier. So how do other activists sort of react, from other areas when obviously you go down there and you're sort of saying, like, I'm for Scottish independence, and presumably they're like take a more sort of unionist stance on that?
Not the English Greens, no. So the Green Party of England and Wales so for a start, the Green Party of England and Wales supports Welsh independence, because that's what the Welsh Greens have decided. They're a pro-independence party. They're still together as one party for England and Wales. Scottish Greens have been separate since 1990, but not because we had a falling out and we split, because we've always supported independence. And in 1990 we thought, we support Scottish independence, it would make sense to be an independent party, and that's obviously been very successful for us. But we're still one Green political family. Families fall out sometimes, but we're still a family. In the same way that we're part of the European Green Party and the Global Greens. Certainly disagreements within our European family at the moment. That's a reference to the German Greens in Gaza. Most Green parties absolutely resolutely support of Palestinian right to freedom from occupation. Our German colleagues extremely iffy on that. But for us, here in the UK, we're separate parties, but I know that Carla Denyer, our co-leader in England, candidate for Bristol Central, I know Carla will be an outstanding MP, and I really want Carla to be an MP. And she asked me to come down and support their campaign. Really, really keen to do so. When I first ran for election in 2016, Caroline Lucas came and campaigned for me. Natalie Bennett, who was the leader of the English Greens at that point, came and campaigned for me. So we're still quite a strong political family, even if we are separate parties. And the Greens in England and Wales have always taken the position that basically their policy on independence is whatever the Scottish Greens say it is, because they believe in self-determination. And it's for us to decide. And we're a pro-independence party, in the same way that it's not for me to tell the people of Wales whether they should be independent or not. But the Welsh Greens believe in independence, so I am very comfortable supporting their right to do that. And actually, it's been really useful for us having politicians in England, Green politicians, stand up and say, no, Scotland should have the right to decide its own future, because at the moment that right is being denied to us, not just by the Conservatives, but that's Labour's position as well. So having Green politicians in Westminster and in English politics generally who can challenge the others and say, well, no, hold on a minute, why should we be the ones to deny the people of Scotland a right to choose their own future? That's actually really, really powerful, because it's not just Scottish politicians, specifically pro-independent Scottish politicians. Caroline has always said she's not pro or anti-independence, because that's why should she, as an English person, be trying to tell people in Scotland what their future should be? She's absolutely in favour of our right to exercise self-determination. That's democracy, and Greens are absolutely committed to that.
Usually in a kind of unique position there then, because obviously a lot of the other parties are sort of dictating that that's not the case. They don't have that autonomy within Scottish Labour, Scottish Lib Dems, for example. So yeah, I mean,
and sometimes we have different policies. Scottish Greens have generally, historically, been in favour of high-speed rail. English Greens have generally been against HS2 as a specific project. We've not got particularly involved in that because HS2 comes nowhere near Scotland. But there can be divergence between our parties, because ultimately we are separate parties.
And what about behind the scenes? Sorry to interrupt, but is there ever any debate privately when you go down and it's like, it would be better if we were more united on this, or they don't mind?
You do find that from ordinary members of the Greens in England and Wales, because for some of them, quite understandably, it's not necessarily an issue that they're massively familiar with. It's not, clearly you don't join the Green Party of England and Wales to campaign for Scottish independence. So I've had some conversations with folk who they kind of just don't get it, especially because we're not a nationalist party. We wouldn't identify as nationalists. We believe in independence because we're Greens. We're not just Greens who are also nationalists who support independence. And for some of our English colleagues, particularly before Brexit, and this wasn't just the case with some of our English colleagues, this was certainly the case across Europe. And in fact, remember one of our European colleagues, an elected Green, who before Brexit asked us, why are you trying to balkanise the UK? Because their last experience, this tells you what country they're from, it was a German Green. This was before we all fell out over Palestine, fell out with the Germans. The rest of us agree. But their experience of a country breaking up was when the German Greens were in government back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it was the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, which was obviously horrific. So their only point of comparison was that. Obviously, that and Scottish independence are not remotely comparable. Before Brexit, it was quite hard to explain that to some of our European colleagues, because obviously, across most of Europe, nationalism is a nasty, far-right, dangerous political movement, whereas the SNP, for all the disagreements I might have with them, are clearly a kind of centre-left, liberal, social democratic party with a lot of people within it who identify as socialists, actually. So kind of broad party, centre-left. That's not the case in most European countries when you say, oh yeah, the Greens and the Nationalists have gone into coalition. Because the Nationalists in most other European countries are fascists. It means something totally different. So our colleagues were kind of confused by that. Brexit completely changed that to the point where, as indicated, you had a lot of German Greens who really were not enthusiastic about Scottish independence. Then Brexit happened. And in the German Greens manifesto for the next election in 2017, they actually had a section in it about Scotland and supporting Scotland and Northern Ireland, supporting Scotland and Northern Ireland's right to maintain links with the European Union. That was a huge shift. And it's not just the case within the European Green Party, but within European politics in general. You're speaking to Social Democrats, Liberals, even Conservatives from other European countries. And they really just kind of get it now. A lot of them who in the past were very cool about Scottish independence, they're now not just relaxed about it, but there's a lot of quiet enthusiasm. Particularly on the centre-right, you'll find people on the centre-left who are more relaxed about being quite open with their enthusiasm for Scottish independence. But a lot of European politicians that I've met from centre-right parties are quietly, in private, really quite enthusiastic about the idea of an independent Scotland rejoining the EU, and who could not have less in common these days with the Conservative Party. I met one very senior European Conservative, I won't say what country they're from, who...
Anglican, drill at Germany anyway.
But one very senior European Conservative who used to attend UK Conservative Party conferences and then stopped after Brexit because they just felt really unwelcome, like on a kind of that personal level, like just the politics shifted. Now, obviously, I never had sympathies with people, on the centre-right even before Brexit, but the extent to which the UK Tory party has isolated itself from mainstream Conservative politics in Europe, I think is a really underreported dimension. I've diverged so far from your original question about the English Greens here.
No, that's all right. It was interesting. I'll have to challenge you though, Ross, because you were saying there that SNP are centre-left, but then earlier on when you were talking, you were sort of saying, they've moved to the right, and that was the driving force behind Humza and the Bute House Agreement. So, if you can kind of think about that for a second, and then obviously you're talking about independence and this, the Europeans seemingly up for it now, whereas when we had the referendum back in 2014 and prior to that, the messages were very much, we're not sure. They weren't. They
were outright hostile.
They were. I don't know why I'm being diplomatic about this. There wasn't any sort of great public assertion that this would be welcomed. So hopefully that will change if obviously we go for it again. But with the ending of the Bute House Agreement, do you think that there's going to be a coalition again, like the last time it was between yourself, the Socialist Party and the SNP, or do you think it would be more of an independent campaign for each of the main players?
I think we can absolutely still campaign together for independence. As I said, ending the Bute House Agreement, tragic, avoidable. Humza made an error and he owned that error. And I think he deserves respect for the way that he personally took ownership of it. We absolutely not just are capable of campaigning together for independence, but we should, right? There are individuals within the SNP that I will not be falling over myself to campaign with because we don't really share much of a vision for independence beyond the basics of we will all vote yes together. But I think the vast majority of people in the SNP are Social Democrats or something in that kind of broad centre-left space. Now, the Greens are more radically on the left. We're eco-socialists, we're anti-capitalists, but there's a kind of broad shared vision of a more progressive Scotland. A Scotland that is further to the left than it is possible to be within the UK and the constraints of Westminster, which is absolutely designed to maintain right-wing politics. That's why you've got a UK Labour Party that is not exactly overflowing with left-wing reformist zeal. We can absolutely campaign together, because last time around 2014, we weren't in government together. The SNP had a single party government at that point. The Greens were in Parliament and the SSP were outside of Parliament by that point, but we're still capable of campaigning together. Because actually what I think was the strength of the Yes movement in 2014, one of the biggest strengths, was that it was a movement with such diversity of vision within it. And that those visions kind of mutually reinforced the point that we disagreed on things like NATO, the monarchy. We disagreed on the currency at that point. The SNP have come closer to our position of a new Scottish currency now. But those disagreements kind of emphasise that point of, Scotland should be able to make decisions over stuff like this. Scotland should be able to decide who its head of state is. Scotland should be able to decide which international organisations it's a member of. But we can't without independence. I think we should be relaxed about that diversity of views. Where I caveat that is in people's views about basic issues of human rights and respect for other people. So I will absolutely, I'll share a stage with somebody who does believe Scotland should be in NATO, that the British monarch should be our head of state and that we should maintain the pound. I disagree with those positions, but you can obviously have a civil and substantial and important debate where you disagree with it. What I don't want to do is share platforms in the independence campaign with people who would happily deny the rights of other people and deny the basic dignity of other people, because that, to me, is so fundamentally incompatible with my vision for what Scotland can and should be. So broad-based movement, absolutely. The movement, I think it's fair to say, has got broader, for better and for worse, since 2014. So while I'll happily share a stage with most people in the SNP and campaign alongside them, and I think that's a given, and nothing about the ending the Bute House Agreement has changed that. There are other actors within the independence movement who the Greens don't share stage with. We will not be sharing a platform with the leadership of the Alba Party, for example. Now, we don't really need to, because they don't seem to have any measurable public support. They've never got anybody elected, and I don't expect they will. If we're in a position ahead of the next independence referendum where that question's being asked of, will you work with the SNP to campaign for independence? Absolutely. That doesn't require us to be in government together. And actually, I think it's really important for the cause that we can explain the fact that we have differences, but we're campaigning together, because fundamentally we believe that we should have the opportunity to see out those differences and let the public decide what this country should be. And at the moment, our differences on issues like NATO and the monarchy are a bit academic, because Scotland, as a country that's not independent, cannot make those decisions.
And just the last time, did you put that to your membership then, presumably? Like when before the Yes campaign, was there a vote to say we want to enter a coalition of the party up for this? Yeah,
so in I think it was our autumn 2012 party conference, we had a vote on whether or not to take part in the Yes Scotland campaign. Now, we had already started taking part in it, because we were invited to join Yes Scotland like the day or 2 days before it launched. And we couldn't exactly say, oh no, hold on, it's May, our conference is in October, we need to wait a couple of months. So the party got involved in the campaign because our policy has always been to support independence, and we'd been in pro-independence organisations with the SNP before. So the Scottish Independence Convention that was established 20 years ago this year, actually. So we kind of took this assumption, took the leap that our members would want us to at least get involved in the first instance and see what this is like. And then we got to the party conference in October, and there had been some points of tension and disagreement with the SNP. I'd started working for Yes Scotland by that point, so seeing a lot of it in the inside. But our membership absolutely took the view that no, we've always believed in independence. This is our opportunity to get out there and to really campaign for it as part of this broad movement. Of course, we're going to take it. I fully expect our members would take a similar position again if it was about taking part in a shared broad campaign, not in unifying behind one specific vision, because we campaigned together through Yes Scotland. We as a party were always clear. The Scottish Greens did not agree with the white paper that the Scottish Government produced, that detailed plan for what independence would look like on day one. We accepted the SNP had the right and actually the duty to publish that white paper and to answer those questions. We just disagreed with some of those answers. More recently, while we were in government together, we were working on the Building a New Scotland series. So that was, rather than one massive doorstop paper that answered all the questions, that was multiple papers on the economy, the immigration system, citizenship, pensions, we worked on those together, and there was newspaper reports about the fact that once every 2 weeks, myself and Jamie Hepburn, the then Minister for Independence, would meet and go through it all. And there was actually much more to it than that, but the meetings came up in the Freedom of Information returns. That allowed us to build more of a shared vision, but with important points of disagreement to it. So, we published the Building a New Scotland series, and some of those papers said the Scottish Government's position is that Scotland should be in NATO. But the Bute House Agreement says the Greens disagree with that, and we already knew that disagreement was fine. So we'll campaign together where we agree. We'll continue, I think we absolutely will continue to do that. And where we disagree, we should see it as a strength, not a weakness.
No, I agree. What's the path to independence then? Like, is this something that's cutting through on the doorstep sooner? Do you think people are really care about it, or there's too much going on with bills going up and everything else that's happening in society?
Yeah, the challenge for those of us in the independence movement is to really talk to people about the links between the Constitution and the fact that their bills are going up, and the link between the Constitution and the climate crisis. The issues that really matter to people in this election, and that is things like it's the economy, the cost of living, health, education, etc. For us, is to say, this is Westminster's cost of living crisis. The cost of living crisis the UK's experienced isn't inevitable. The fact that people's energy bills are going up, yes, is in part a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but that's not the whole story. Look at plenty of other countries, but that's not the case. You look at France, where the French state-owned energy company, EDF, capped the rise in bills, I think 3%. Our energy bills were not capped at a 3% rise. So clearly things can be different. But of course, energy is regulated at a UK level, and the UK government is not willing to intervene in the energy market. Even Labour with this GB Energy proposal. It's an energy company, but it won't produce any energy or sell any energy. So I'm not sure what it does. I think it's a kind of middleman. We need something fundamentally different, especially in a country like Scotland that is so energy rich and yet has so many people living in fuel poverty. So the challenge for us, not just over the next couple of weeks with the election campaign, but much longer term, is to explain the link between these day-to-day issues that people face and independence and the Constitution. Because I can say from 3 years of us being in government, just how frustrating it is to try and govern the country, to try and make the country better with one hand tied behind your back all the time, and just constantly coming up against these barriers where you just cannot make things line up. So classic example is Scottish Government delivered the Scottish Child Payment and then increased it to £20 a week. At roughly the same time as we increased the child payment to £20 a week, the UK government cut universal credit by £20 a week from what it was in the pandemic period. So it was like we took one step forward, they took one step back. They cut our budget, and yet we're expected to do more, but with less money. So there's a challenge for us there to actually join the dots between these issues, and also see things like the vast majority of children in Scotland who live in poverty, true across the UK, are in a working household. Now, I do not buy into the demonisation of people who are not employed, but the vast majority of kids in poverty live in a household with a working parent or guardian. They're in poverty because so many people in this country are paid poverty wages by their employer. The Scottish Government can do almost nothing about that because the minimum wage is reserved to the UK Government. Now, when the Greens were in government, we did what we could, which is to set conditions to say if you're a business who gets a grant from the Scottish Government or has a contract with the Scottish Government, you need to pay at least the real living wage. And we've seen a boost in living wage employers as a result of that. But that's kind of fiddling at the edges. It's absolutely benefiting some people. We're proud of that. But it's not the big transformation that our society needs. So that's the challenge for the independence movement. How do you join the dots on these issues? And for me, I think rather than focus on process, like how do we get a referendum, how do we become independent, the focus now for our movement needs to be on persuading people of independence itself. Because the last thing that people want when I knock on their door is for me to talk to them about the process of independence, the process of securing a referendum, of Section 30 orders and Supreme Court rulings. No, they want to talk about the issues that affect their life and big global stuff. They do want to talk about climate, they do want to talk about Gaza, but they don't want to talk about political or legal process. And for us, the independence movement will be in a much, much stronger position to get past the process barriers that have been thrown up in our way if we can actually move independence to be the clear, consistent majority position in Scotland. If independence is consistently polling at 55%, 60%, whatever it is, but if that's consistent, that makes a huge difference. I think it makes it unsustainable for a UK government to take the kind of anti-democratic denial position that it's taken. I'm much better off speaking to people on doorsteps about why independence will benefit them and their community than I am talking to them about that 55%, 60%, about the Supreme Court, about the Scotland Act.
The process stuff is boring, and there's a reason why I think there's bad actors in the country sort of promoting this stance. But anyway, just on that subject, one of your comrades or one of your colleagues at the Parliament there, Douglas Ross, has obviously been a bit of a sticky wicket recently. So what do you make of this? He's knifed his colleague in the back. It looks like the guy's on his sickbed and he's stepping in there to win his seat. If he does win his seat, he's going to step down from Scottish Parliament. But if he doesn't win it, then he's going to do us all a big favour and stay there, even though he's got his eye on a job elsewhere and now stood in. So what do you make of all this?
I think I'm going to borrow a phrase from the No campaign in 2014 and say, can't Scotland have the best of both worlds? And Douglas both resigns from the Scottish Parliament and doesn't bother going to Westminster. Surely the best thing for the people in Scotland is for him to just stop having any role in our public life, because he's a man who's made it much more toxic. Like, not just the policies that he advocates. Douglas Ross defends the 2-child cap and the rape clause. He defends the UK government continue to sell arms to Israel. His politics are awful. He was asked, what would he do if he was Prime Minister for a day? And of all the things that he could have thought of, the first thing that Douglas Ross thought of was to take action against the Gypsy Traveller community. Not to make anybody's lives better, but to take action, and he meant that in the most punitive way, against a demonised minority community. That says a lot about the guy. But as well as that, Douglas Ross has made the Scottish Parliament a much, much more toxic and divisive place with the way he behaves and the way he has encouraged his MSPs to behave. And the behaviour by the Conservatives towards women in every other party, in particular, across all MSPs, but in particular, the way a number of Conservative MSPs behave towards women this session is beyond unacceptable. It's making the Parliament a really toxic environment to work in, and it is putting women off from standing for election, or in some cases standing for re-election as MSPs. Really good women from across multiple parties. And Douglas Ross is the leader of the party responsible for that behaviour, and he needs to take responsibility for it, and he's not. Absolutely not. So I've got no sympathy whatsoever for the guy. I don't know David Duckett, the MP who he's screwed over here, but I think even by the Conservative standards, to screw over a colleague and close friend while he's literally sitting in a spinal injuries unit in hospital recovering, that is cold. That's really cold. The banter outcome here is that Douglas, after having done this and cost himself his job as party leader, that he has actually generated such a local backlash to his behaviour that he doesn't win that seat. Because otherwise, on paper, it looks like a pretty safe Conservative seat. I can totally envisage a situation where people locally are so disgusted by the way that Douglas has behaved that he doesn't win that seat. So he's gone through all this, he's lost his job as party leader, he's screwed over his friend, and he doesn't win the seat. There would be a kind of poetic justice to that, plus it would be one fewer Conservative MP, and that's no bad thing. In that situation, though, I think regardless of whether he wins or loses the Westminster seat, he has to resign from the Scottish Parliament, because he's made it abundantly clear that he doesn't want to be in our Parliament. And being in our Parliament and serving the people of Scotland is an immense privilege, and you should only do it if you want to. The first bit of advice that I got when I came in the door in 2016 when I was elected was from Mike Russell, the former SNP MSP, a really good man. And Mike came over, I'd known him a little bit before, came over, shook my hand, congratulated me, and he said, enjoy this, but the moment you stop enjoying it, leave. And I think that, that's advice that I've really taken with me. Douglas obviously doesn't enjoy it. It gives me a bit of a smirk to think of Douglas Ross being unhappy, got to be honest. But he clearly doesn't want to be in the Scottish Parliament. He clearly doesn't think the Scottish Parliament is worth his time. But the Scottish Parliament is really bloody important, and he should absolutely step down because he doesn't want to be there. My best case scenario is he loses the Westminster seat and he steps down from the Scottish Parliament. He's finally out of our public life, and we can begin the recovery from the toxic influence that he's had.
I get full agreement with me on that, Ross. Ross, there is other stuff I want to ask you, but we both want to go to the football basically, right, Jamie? So
Aye.
I think we'll just call it there, mate, and I really appreciate you coming in. It's been nice to chat to you, and I wish you all the best in the election, mate.
Cheers, Paul. Thanks, Ross.